And with that, we'll begin today's lesson, the final lesson, number 6. So we went through the entire Talmud course so far. We spoke about the compilation of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put together in the year 200 CE. And if you open up your books to page 211, you'll see figure 6.1. There's a graph, and let's put it on the board here. I want you to kind of bookmark it, because we may go back to it several times throughout tonight's lesson, just to get a better understanding. So just kind of slip something there so we could look back at it. But I'll just go through it quickly, and then we'll go through the class. And by the end of tonight, you'll get a better understanding about what we're talking about in this graph. Tonight's lesson is called The Talmud Until Today. What happened after the Talmud was finished? Can people still add to the Talmud? Can we continue to discuss halachic rules and laws? How does that work? So to give a little bit of a timeline here, in the year 40 or so, the Sanhedrin, the court that stood in Jerusalem, which ruled on all halachic decisions, ceased to receive halachic questions. They no longer were able to rule on halachic matters, which made it very, very difficult, because until then, it was very simple. Anyone had a question about Jewish law, they went to their court. If they didn't know it, they brought it to their court, and it went up all the way until the Sanhedrin. If no one else knew the answer, the Sanhedrin would rule, and then that would be binding on all Jewish people as Jewish law, similar to the Supreme Court in America. But once that ceased once they ceased to decisively resolve any halachic questions, we can no longer have a unified Jewish opinion on anything. So what happened was, a few years later, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in 200 CE composed he put together the Mishnah, gathered all of the teachings, including some arguments, Hillel and Shammai and many others, and put them together in a beautiful text called the Mishnah. And that was it. Beautiful. People were able to now have like somewhat of cliff notes to study the oral tradition, the oral Torahs that won't be forgotten. And then in the year 430 to about 500 CE was the compilation of the Talmud. That was done by Ravina and Rav Ashi. They put together the Talmud, collecting all of the sages' discussions on the Mishnah. So this took place mainly in Babylonia and Bavel, modern day Iraq, where there was big yeshivas where they would study the Talmud. And Ravina and Rav Ashi compiled all of these teachings of all these yeshivas discussing the Mishnah, put it together in a big book called the Gemara, and that was the end of the Talmud. And that's where we're up to in today's lesson. But after the Talmud was finished, what goes on? What is the deal? How do we continue to study the Torah? How do we continue to come to new laws and explanations? So let's look at page 212, text 1. So before I read text 1, once the Talmud was completed, anything that was written in the Talmud became binding on all Jewish people, as if it was like the Sanhedrin. So let's read text 1. Ravina and Rav Ashi and their colleagues constituted the end of the era of the sages who authoritatively transmitted the oral Torah and who set in place ordinances, decrees, and customs that became accepted as normative practice by all the Jewish people. By contrast, any ordinance, decree, or custom instituted by any court that arose after the Talmud in any land, whether it was instituted for the inhabitants of that land or for an entire region, did not become accepted as normative by the entire Jewish people. Therefore, if one of the post-Talmudic scholars taught that in a specific case the judgment ought to be a certain way, And then a later court to subsequently determine that the earlier ruling was an inaccurate interpretation of the Talmud. We need not follow the earlier conclusion. We follow whichever ruling is more logically correct and in greater accordance with the Talmud, whether its author lived in an earlier or later generation. So if the Talmud says that chicken goes under the category of meat, in the sense that we can't mix milk and chicken together, that becomes Jewish law. That is, it goes across the board for all Jewish people. But after the Talmud, if someone comes along and says, you know what, I think that there's another interpretation to understanding this view, this discussion about whether you're allowed to eat on the eve of Passover or not. I think it could be understood a little differently. So it's very nice, but because the Talmud already ruled on that point, we already had the whole discussion in the Talmud about the laws of the eve of Passover. You can't change anything. Once the Talmud was compiled, that becomes the law. That's point number one that the Rambam is making. Point number two, the point number two is that any post-Talmudic scholar that comes up with a new question, a question that was not discussed in the Talmud. Let's say, are you allowed to, use electricity on Shabbat? They didn't talk about electricity. They just spoke about fire. But is electricity fire? And that could be a discussion about how electricity works with the laws of Shabbat. That's a post-Talmud discussion because they didn't have those questions. Or what about laws about flying in an airplane? Or what about laws about medical ethics? All these new information that comes up that they didn't have in the Talmud. And a Talmudic scholar rules in a certain way. And then let's say a few years later, some new information comes to light. And they say, you know what? We think that the previous rabbi who ruled on this ruling is, we don't think that's accurate. We think it should be differently. You could do that because it's after the Talmud. We always go by what's more logical, what makes the most sense, what fits the most with the Talmudic understanding. So we always use the principles from the Talmud, and then we derive laws based on the Talmud's discussion. But me and you could have a discussion about what the Talmud meant, and had come to different conclusions. So we always are going to follow what makes most sense, but no one has any authoritative ruling over the entire Jewish people. So I want you to look at page 214. There's a key term here called a posek. And I think it's important that when we're studying the Talmud, you know what a posek is. A posek literally means a decisor, someone who decides a Jewish law. He makes a ruling within Jewish law. How do you become a posek? So a posek is someone who is obviously well versed in the Torah, and you have to have what we call smicha. Smicha means you get permission from your teacher to teach laws in that area. So you could get smicha in the laws of kosher. You could get smicha in the laws of civil cases. A lot of people get smicha in the laws of kosher and non-kosher, but to get smicha in the laws of civil matters, that's already like a step up. We call it yadin yadin. It's like a big status. Either way, you gotta be well versed in the Torah law to be a posek, someone who's able to rule on the Torah law. But obviously the obvious question comes to mind, which is, why couldn't the Talmud just continue? Right? What the Talmud essentially was a compilation of a bunch of teachings, of a bunch of posek, a bunch of poseks, a bunch of rabbis giving their lectures and discussions on Torah law, and then the Talmud just compiled it all together. So why can't we just continue? Have everyone give a discussion, and then every once in a while we'll just make another book called, the Talmud, I guess edition number 2, addition number 3, and we'll just keep adding to the body of the Talmud, right? So the Rambam answers that question. Page 2, it's 214 still. Text number 2. After the era of Rav Ashi, again, Rav Ashi was the one who put together the Talmud. After the era of Rav Ashi, the people of Israel grew increasingly dispersed throughout the world, reaching the furthest geographic extremes and the most remote islands. War became more prevalent and travel was impeded by armed forces. The study of Torah dwindled and students no longer attended yeshivot in their thousands and myriads as before. So the Rambam gives a very practical answer. He doesn't only say because that's the way God wanted it to happen, which is obviously probably a good answer. Everything happens because, that's God wants to happen. But the Rambam gives a very practical answer. He says it was just not practical. After the Talmud was finished, there was a period where there were many, the community in Bavel in Babylonia continued to thrive, but the Jewish communities started to spread out. Jews went to Spain, Jews went to the Middle East, North Africa, Jews went to Germany, Portugal, and France. We started to spread out all over the place. And then that continued, by the way. The Jews didn't stop there. They just continued going until we're here in Oviedo, Who would have thought? But that's what happened. And practically speaking, there was no way to discuss Torah across the world. This is before telephones, it was just impractical. And on top of that, the Rambam throws in like a little side point that there was a lot of wars going on. And wars made it very hard to travel. Today, even if there was no way to call someone in Australia, which there is, but even if there wasn't, you could travel. It may take time, but you could travel. And in those days, you had to go. You had to go by horse and buggy or whatever it was, or camel or boat. But you could make it. It took some time. It took maybe some weeks, some months, but you got there. But if there's wars going on, there's borders that are closed off. That's it. You can't. So what happens? What happens is every community had to become their own little Torah center. So you have a question in your community. Let's say a guy's living in Germany. He has a question. So he goes to his rabbi in Germany. Says, what do I do? I'm trying to figure out whether I'm allowed to eat on the eve of Passover or not. And the Germany rabbi will give his ruling based on his understanding of the Talmud. Now, we just mentioned that not necessarily is everyone going to agree with him. The rabbi in Spain could have an entirely different understanding of the Talmud and come to a completely different conclusion. So what people do is the rabbi of your community becomes somewhat binding on that community. His decision becomes binding on that community, and that's our community follows this rabbi, and that's it. I don't know what they do in Spain, and Spain doesn't know what they do in Germany. Germany doesn't know what they do in France. Because there's no other way to communicate. So we all have to follow our tradition. This is the way we understood the Talmud, and that's what we're going to do. So that's why the Talmud couldn't continue over the years. It just had to stop. There was no one place everyone could look to get their information from. Everyone had to go to their local rabbi. That was it. Now, I just want to point out that today, it's not as much geographic. Hey, how are you? We'll have to squeeze you in somewhere. It's not so much geographic. Today it's more, where our parents came from, where our ancestors came from. So I'm sure you guys heard of the Ashkenaz and Sephardic traditions, right? Ashkenaz literally means Germany, and Sephard means Spain. And they're two different areas, two different places in the world, geographically. But nowadays, people follow, if let's say a community from Germany a bunch of people, or even a single individual, one family move to Oviedo, Florida, they'll continue keeping their tradition of what they kept back in Germany, called the Ashkenazic tradition. If someone's Sephardic, they'll continue keeping the Sephardic tradition as they did in Sephard when they were in Spain. And the same. So a lot of times it's not necessarily geographic. It could also be where my parents came from. And on top of that, because it's not geographic, there could be within one place, there can be different communities. In Brooklyn, there's a Sephardic community, there's an Ashkenazi community, there's a Hasidic, they have a bunch of different communities all in the same place, because they're not following, there's no one rabbi in Brooklyn that has the say on what goes on. Everyone's following their rabbis back in Germany or Spain or wherever they came from. So that's just something to understand when it comes to post-Talmudic era. So how do we come to a ruling in the Talmud? How do we understand the Talmud after the Talmud was finished? So obviously, if we have a question, we go to our rabbi, our posek, so to say. But how do these rabbis know what they're talking about? So obviously, these rabbis would look in the Talmud. Someone asks a question, you go to the Talmud for all the answers. The Talmud discusses pretty much everything, including flying towers, as we saw in the last week. Some interesting topics there. But so what happened is, let's say a guy goes to his rabbi and he says, Rabbi, what's the deal? Am I allowed to eat a meal on Friday afternoon? What do you guys think? If you guys were a rabbi, we discussed a whole discussion of Talmudic discussion about eating on the eve of Passover and Friday, Shabbat. So if you could just say yes or no, what do you guys think? Allowed to have a meal on Friday afternoon or not? Like, what do you think the conclusion of our Talmudic discussion was?
It depends.
It depends. Yes or no? The guy's asking, yes or no? Friday afternoon, yes or no? No. The guy's asking, I'm asking practically speaking, what do I do? No? You say no. You're not allowed to. Anyone on the yes train?
I say yes.
You say yes. Okay, so we got yes. You say yes?
It depends upon if you're going to your buddies or not. You want to get meals, you can't go through.
Good.
Good answer.
Yeah, okay, before the time. So that's before the time for sure. Friday afternoon after mincha time. So after the cutoff. So as you see, it's not necessarily so clear. We don't know. And I'll tell you the truth is, it's not just a debate in this room. It's actually if you read the Talmud discussion, there was no conclusion. If you could read it a million times, the Talmud never came to a conclusion about whether you could have a meal on Friday afternoon. It was pretty clear about Passover. Passover was pretty clear. Passover, we're not allowed to have a meal. The Mishnah said that pretty clearly, and that it sounded like most people agree with. But on Friday afternoon, there was no consensus. We brought two opinions, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed. Rabbi Yossi says you are allowed. But the Talmud never told us who we follow. Do we follow Rabbi Yehuda or do we follow Rabbi Yossi? So are we allowed or are we not allowed to? What's the deal? Right? So even though we have the Talmud, understanding what the Talmud was telling us is sometimes not so easy to get to. What was the end discussion? What was the end conclusion? So on top of that, besides the fact that Talmud in general is a little bit complicating, which I think if the more you study, you could get there. That's such a big deal. But there's also a certain language barrier because it's written in Aramaic. It's not so easy to just translate. And on top of that, there's no conclusions. Not no conclusions, but not always are there conclusions in the Talmud about what we're supposed to do. So let's look at page 217, text number 3. This is from the Rambam. The Rambam's explaining how the Talmud works, how difficult it is to understand the Talmud. The Talmud's manner of expression is extremely profound. Furthermore, it's composed in Aramaic with some other languages thrown in as well. that vernacular was well understood by all the Jews in Babylonia during the era in which the Talmud was composed. In other locations, however, and even within Babylonia during the subsequent era of the Gaonim, which the Gaonim lived right after the compilation of the Gemara, no one could understand this language without being taught. So how do you know the language? You have to have studied the Talmud with a teacher who studied the Talmud in the generation before you, who studied it, one generation prior to that, all the way, and you got to find a teacher who goes all the way back to the time where they put the Talmud together, where someone has a tradition, and this is how we know the Talmud. This is how we understand it. So the first written text that we have explaining the Talmud is from a generation right after the Talmud. Called the rabbis are called the Gaonim. Gaonim, and if you look at page 218, you'll see key term 6.2. Gaon or Gaonim for plural means splendor or pride, but it refers to a leader. It refers to the sages that lived right after the Talmud was put together, and they lived in Babylonia during the 7th and 11th centuries. So the first written text that we have are questions that were posed to these Gaonim, asking questions about the understanding of the Talmud, and we have the answers that these Gaonim answered back. So those are the first text that we have of anyone explaining the Gemara. So it's interesting that they lived in Bavel, and they even studied at the same yeshivot, the same academies that the Talmud was put together in. Now, obviously, a few years later, but the same yeshivot. So they had within their library, I guess, maybe even some manuscripts of Talmudic texts that they were able to kind of look back to explain and clarify. They also had, it was my teacher's teacher who put together the Talmud. It was pretty close in time. So if you look at page 219, you'll see a graph. Here are some interesting questions that were posed to the Gaonim in trying to understand the Talmud. So some questions, we don't know who they came from, but we know who responded. We know who responded. And that's usually a lot of times with letters. We have the answer, and with the answer, you can usually understand the question, but you don't always have the letter that was sent to the person. Either way, so let's go through them one by one. So the first question, we don't know who wrote it, who asked the question, but the responder was Rabbi Ratchanoi Goin. And the question was, is the custom of reciting Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur appropriate? Interesting question. The Talmud doesn't talk about Kol Nidre, but just to give you guys a little understanding, Kol Nidre is a prayer about annulling vows. And we have a custom to say it on Yom Kippur. I'm pretty sure today everyone does it. But in those days, they were asking, people are doing it, is that an appropriate custom? Does that make sense? On the day of Yom Kippur, we're annulling vows. So the answer was that we have heard that this prayer is recited in other lands. However, it's not our custom in Babylonia. In other words, I guess it's a custom. Like, in other words, if you have the custom to do it, it's a great custom. Continue. But we personally don't have the custom in Babylonia to read the Kol Nidre prayer. The next line is from a question from Rabbi Yaakov ben Nissim. And he writes to Rabbi Sharira Goin. The question was, how and when was the Mishnah compiled? What are the Braitot? And why are they not part of the Mishnah? So the answer to that question we actually discussed in our class in lessons 2 and 3, all about how the Mishnah was put together. A Braisa were the texts that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't feel that he wanted to put them into the Mishnah. But either way, if you want to review it, you're welcome to always go back to lesson 2 and 3. All the texts are there. The next question, again, we don't know who wrote it, but to Rabbi Sharira Goin, and he asked, is astrology authentic? I guess astrology was making its waves back then. And they were want to try to figure out, is that a Jewish thing? Do we believe in astrology? Is that legit? So the answer was, even if astrology is authentic, I guess doesn't want to give an opinion on that. He says it could only determine a particular inclination. However, individuals always maintain the free choice to commit or to refrain from a specific action. In other words, astrology can't force you to do anything. You always have a free choice. Astrology, if it is indeed real and does have some rulership over you, it's only an inclination. It only will pull you towards something to get you to want to do something, but you always have the free choice to choose whether it actually has an effect on you. And the last question was to Rabbi Haigoin, and the question was, the Talmud explains that there were 3 distinct customs regarding the shofar sounds on Rosh Hashanah, until Rabbi Avo instituted that all 3 sounds should be sounded. How did such varied practices originally emerge concerning a mitzvah that is performed every year? So he's asking, if we blow the shofar every single year, how'd they have a question about how the shofar is blown? Shouldn't they just go to the guy who blew the shofar last year and say, hey, what'd you do? How do you have a question about how to blow the shofar? This is something we do every single year. How do you have a difference of what sound to do? So that was the question. So the answer was that all 3 customs of the different sounds that we do were valid, and each community followed its preferred practice. In other words, every community did it a little differently. Rabbi Avo standardized the practice for everyone to avoid confusion. So he made a uniform way of blowing the shofar and said, this is the way we're going to do it. And he took all 3 different customs of blowing the shofar and he kind of put them into one shofar blow, which is why we blow so many different blows. We do like 30 different sound blasts to kind of go according to all the different customs of blowing. But that way, everyone's blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah the same way. We're one Judaism, one people. We don't have different people doing different things, and it made it a little more uniform. But either way, this is just a taste of some of the questions that were posed all the way back in the times of the Gaonim. And it's interesting that these questions are so basic today. Some of these questions, like reading Kol Nidre, they're trying to figure out whether everyone knows you read Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur. Even the 5-year-old kid knows. So we know this as a fact, but this was questions that they had all the way back then. So that's the first period after the Talmud. Here we go. So the Gaonim wrote answers to halachic questions which were asked by Jewish communities. And then we get to the second part of understanding the Talmud until today. After the period of the Gaonim, there was a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. And he wanted to make the Talmud a little easier for people to understand and a little easier for people to come to conclusions from the Talmud. Right? As we pose the question, are you allowed to eat on the eve of Passover? Not allowed? It's up in the air. Who knows? So he wanted to make it a lot easier. What do we do? What's the end conclusion of the Talmud? What's the practical conclusion? So Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi put together a book, what we call halachic digests. He basically added a few words to the Talmud to just give off a proper ending, a proper conclusion. He lived in North Africa and Spain. Let's read to page 220, text 4a. This is a text from the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and he wrote as follows. A lot of the black text, what are the 2 colors in your book? There's black and what? Page 220, 4a.
Brown.
Black and brown? So black is a text from the Talmud, from the Gemara, and brown is the Rif's addition, adding his own words. Okay, so let's read it. The Mishnah writes as follows. One must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover, from close to the time for reciting the Mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. Sound familiar? It should. The Gemara comments, we learned in a Brisa, one should not eat on the eve of Shabbat or festivals from the time of Mincha and onward, so that one enters Shabbat or the festivals with an appetite. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Conversely, Rabbi Yossi says that one may continue eating until it grows dark. So now comes the Rif's addition. The law follows the view of Rabbi Yossi because there is a rule that the law favors Rabbi Yossi over his colleagues, and our Mishnah regarding Passover Eve concurs with all views because Rabbi Yossi will concede that eating is prohibited on the eve of Passover due to the obligation to eat matzah.
What's a footnote?
Literally a footnote. And if you look at text 4b, you'll see all of the text that he takes out. You'll see the crossed out text. You'll see he just kind of, anything that's not crossed out, he quotes. The brown is his text, and anything he just crossed out, probably almost like 3/4 of the Talmud's text. He just because it's all a discussion about who the Mishnah is following, but that doesn't really apply to the end law. Are we following Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi? That's all people want to know. In other words, practically speaking, what do I do? Am I allowed to eat on Friday night or not allowed to eat Friday afternoon or no? So he brings the simple, just what you need to know. There's two opinions, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi. We follow Rabbi Yossi. Next. Finished. So simple, right? Make sense?
We need Cliff Notes. We need the Cliff Notes version.
That's what he did. He made he just put on those little cliff notes. That's it. So let's look at exercise 6.3, page. Oh yeah, sure.
It doesn't say why they chose this.
It does say why.
It does? Where?
It says the reason is because the law favors Rabbi Yossi over his colleagues. We want to know why the law favors Rabbi Yossi over his colleagues. And the general rule is that the law favors Rabbi Yossi, and that's actually written in the Talmud. The Talmud says that in another location that the law usually follows Rabbi Yossi, and the reason is because Rabbi Yossi had a certain depth to his views, that every time we tried to disprove Rabbi Yossi's opinion, he always was able to back it up and bring an incredible amount of sources and logic to his views, that his views always stood the test of debate. So the ruling became that we generally follow Rabbi Yossi. That became the general rule. So he brings that. He writes that. He doesn't give the whole background of how or why, but he just says that's the reason. So look at 6.3, exercise 6.3, page 223, right? Using the Rif's little, his text, we have two questions. Is a meal permitted on the eve of Passover? Yes or no? No. According to everybody. Rabbi Yehuda says you're never allowed to have a meal on the eve of any Shabbat or holiday, and Rabbi Yossi also agrees that you're not allowed to have a meal on Passover, on the eve of Passover. Number two, is a meal permitted on the eve of Shabbat or other festival? Yes, we follow Rabbi Yossi. That's the end. Rabbi Yossi says you are. Next. So if I want to have a sit down for a late lunch at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, according to the halacha, according to the rule, there's no problem. The only issue would be Passover because there's a big mitzvah of eating matzah. So that's a unique law. But we follow Rabbi Yossi. There's no problem to eat a meal. Now, yeah, whatever. Either way. So there were other people like that, similar to the Rif, who did similar jobs. I'm only going through some of the notable, commentaries or sages that really almost changed the way we see the Talmud. So the Rif was one of those big sages who really changed the way we learn Talmud because he added those simple cliff notes that really made it a lot simpler. But
Is it a separate volume, separate book, or is it included in the current?
So he wrote it today. It's put in the back of almost every Talmud set. Okay. He actually did it in the way he wrote his thing was he wrote it in almost a similar format as the Talmud, and he just kind of has the Talmud in the middle, the text, but then he just adds in his own few words. So it almost looks like the Talmud, but it's not. It's in the back of the Talmud usually. But yeah, basically its own book. And on every single tractate, he has another little section in the back of the book with all his little cliff notes. So now we're moving on. Besides for halachic digest, now we're going on to halachic code. So the Rif lacks one thing. It's beautiful if you want to know the end law. But the problem is that there's no systematic structure to the Rif's work. He used the same structure as the Talmud. And the Talmud could sometimes, talk about the randomest laws in the most random places. And sometimes, as we've seen in previous lessons, the Talmud could kind of, go off topic. That we're talking about Passover. Once we're talking about Passover, we'll talk about Kiddush. Once we're talking about Kiddush, we'll talk about Havdalah. And it'll just kind of move from discussion to discussion. And the Rif will just throw in the conclusion, or his little cliff notes, wherever it is in the Talmud. So if, let's say, you are looking for the ruling on on what to, are you allowed to eat on the eve of Passover or not, or are you allowed to eat on the eve of Shabbat or not, the eve of Friday, you don't even know where to look. There's no systematic structure. I mean, you could start opening up the laws of the book of Psachim, which is all about Passover, but then you start flipping pages. This is randomly page 99b. It talks about the eve of Passover. So how am I supposed to find that? I have to know the whole Talmud really to know where to look. It's a little bit. You gotta be a big Torah scholar to know the whole Talmud, to know every question. So that was one issue with the Rif. Although it was beautiful, he put together the end, conclusion of every discussion in the Talmud, but there's no way to find it. I mean, unless you went through the whole Talmud and then you, by memory, it's like, that's, I think it's in Tractate Psachim 99b. And there's guys who could do that. There's definitely people who could do that. They're called Bucky, the people who are fluent in the Talmud. They can tell you where everything is. But the point of these commentaries is to make it more accessible to everyone. So then comes halachic code. This was done by the Rambam. The Rambam put together a legal code of the entire Talmud. He basically restructured everything. The Rambam was obviously proficient in the entire Talmud, and he rewrote it all from the bottom up. Reprogrammed the entire program. Rewrote the code. It was honestly really an incredible job. And what the Rambam really did was he made it practical. He made it independent of the Talmud. He made it organized by topic. And he made it very clear and concise. Let's read text 5, page 224. This is from Maimonides, the Rambam himself. He writes about his own book. This is his introduction to his own book. He says, therefore, I, Moses, the son of Maimon of Spain, girded my loins. I relied upon the rock. Blessed be he. That's referring to God. I examined all these texts and set out to compile the conclusions that can be extracted from all these texts as to what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is ritually impure and what is ritually pure, and the rest of the Torah's laws. I will present all the conclusions in clear language and a concise format so that the entire oral law will be easily accessible to everyone without questions or objections. So the Rambam realized a very simple problem here, is that in order to know how to follow Jewish law, you gotta be really fluent in the whole Talmud. It's ridiculous. Who's gonna be able to do that? So he said he put together his work called the Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah literally means second to the Torah, and he says that all you need is the written Torah, the Bible, and the Mishnah Torah, his code of his legal code, and with that you'll basically have the entire Torah. Because he went through every single topic in the entire Torah, and he organized it by topic. And then the topics are divided into chapters, and those chapters are divided into paragraphs. So if you want to find something, you open up the book of, if let's say you want to find a law about whether you're allowed to eat on the eve of Passover, you open up the book of the laws of holidays, you find the chapter talking about Passover, and you go through the laws. They're not that many, and you find what you're looking for. So if we want to look at our discussion about whether you're allowed to eat on the eve of Passover, how does the Rambam put it? So let's look page 225, text 6. This is the Rambam's so to say, version of the same discussion. Now remember, the Talmud was very complicating, a bunch of laws, a bunch of opinions, back and forth, Brysos flying here and there. But let's read text 6, page 225. It is forbidden to eat on the eve of Passover from a little before the time of Mincha so that we arrive at the eating of matzah with an appetite. However, we may eat a small quantity of fruit or vegetables, as long as we do not eat enough to feel full. By contrast, on the eves of Shabbat or the other festivals, we may continue eating until dark. Simple. Now, one of the beautiful things about this is that you don't even need to open up a Talmud. You don't even need to know about Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi. He doesn't even mention them. He just goes straight to the law. He made a legal code. That's it. It was very simple.
How many books were in the Mission Torah?
The Mishnah Torah is made up of 4 books.
Only 4.
I'm sorry, 14. I meant 14, not 14. 14 books. And those books are divided into categories. Categories are divided into chapters. Chapters are divided into laws or paragraphs. But yeah.
Is there any kind of cross-referencing? So if you wanted to go back to the Talmud and read the discussion, you'd be able to do that, or you're still on your own to find it?
So yes, but only one way. In other words, if you're learning the Rambam, well, actually, you know what? Yes, both ways. Today's Talmuds, both the Talmud and a Rambam will have footnotes on the side. If you open up any Talmud, there's a little guy over here. Sorry, not this guy. Yeah, this guy right here on this side. There's little tiny, there's almost dots you can't even read. They're almost like the tiniest little words. But what it says there is there's a little letter here, and then you look for that letter over here. You find that letter, and then it says Rambam chapter, laws of Passover, chapter 22. And then you could look up the Rambam from, you got to pull out the Rambam on your shelf, and then you could read what the Rambam says regarding that law. And then the same thing is with the Rambam. If you open up the Rambam's book, on the bottom you'll have a footnote, and it'll say from tractate of Psachim 99b. So you could kind of cross-reference back and forth, but that's more of like a modern day. That's more of a modern day invention. They just put notes so you could. It's called a Mara Makom. You're able to research and find out where things came from. A little note on the bottom. But either way, yeah. So the Rambam did a beautiful job. Right now, everyone knows the laws about what to follow, what not to follow, and he put it together very systematically, very organized, so you could find anything you want. You have a question about Shabbat, open up the laws of Shabbat. You have a question about what they did in the temple, open up the laws of the temple. It's all there. You just find the book, find the section, find the chapter, find the law. You may have to read a few laws, but you'll get there. Just like any legal code, it's all organized. So it's interesting. I just want to add that the Rambam, in his tiny little paragraph, he adds one little point that I don't know if you caught, but he says that even on the eve of Passover, you're allowed to eat a small quantity of fruit or vegetables. Where do you get that from? That wasn't in our discussion. We never learned that. We didn't talk about anything about fruit or vegetables. So he's actually adding in a little line from a discussion which happens about 8 pages later in the Talmud about what is a meal. And the Talmud says you're not allowed to eat. Doesn't mean a meal, doesn't mean a snack. And the conclusion of the Talmud over there was that it means you're allowed to have a snack. Even after the time that you're not supposed to eat, you're not supposed to start a meal, you're allowed to have a snack. You're allowed to eat an apple. You're allowed to sit down and have a salad. No big deal. As long as you're not going to be too full to eat your Seder. So the Rambam just throws it in as a line, but he's really referencing an entire discussion in the Talmud later on. So the brilliance of the Rambam's work was really unprecedented. It was really incredible. I just wanted to throw that out there. After the Rambam, there was only one issue with the Rambam. There's only one issue. One thing that we needed to perfect. Number one, two problems with the Rambam. Number one, the Rambam, he lived in the 11th century, so I don't know, let's say 500 years after the Talmud. And there were a lot of new questions that come up after the Talmud was finished. Modern questions, relatively modern, that the Rambam doesn't talk about. Most of what the Rambam talks about is only what's in the Talmud. So what happens if there's a new question? You can't look at the Rambam anymore about microwaves. He doesn't talk about it. It's not there. He doesn't talk about airplanes. There's no way to. So if you're well versed in the Talmud, then you could derive the laws based on what the Talmud talks about in other scenarios. But because the Rambam wrote a legal code, you can't infer from the Rambam in other scenarios. It's just what he wrote is what he wrote. The other issue with the Rambam is that it's only one opinion. It's only his opinion. As we mentioned, after the Talmud, you could have different opinions about what the law is or what the conclusion of the Talmud was. So the Rambam was saying, this is the way I understand the Talmud. But other people could disagree. So the Rambam didn't write varying opinions. He didn't say, I say this and my colleague in Spain said that. But he just he wanted to be simple, so he wrote his opinion. This is the way I understand the Talmud. It's a great book, don't get me wrong. It's not gonna work in all scenarios. So after that, we have something called the Code of Jewish Law. What we call the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch, which was put together by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and Rabbi Yosef Cairo was a Sephardic rabbi, and there was also a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Isserlis. He was an Ashkenazic rabbi, and he put footnotes on the Code of Jewish Law whenever there's a varying opinion between Sephardic communities and Ashkenazic communities. So they put together this book called the Code of Jewish Law. Now what they did there was they didn't just take one opinion. They took different opinions. They took different opinions, but usually the best part was that they would put all the opinions together, and they would put the opinion that they feel is the opinion that they feel is the most, that kind of makes the most sense or the most works the best. They put it last. So usually you kind of have, the last thing you read is usually their opinion, so to say, about what the law is. So you have a code which now not only has new questions that came up later, but also you also have different opinions. It's not just one person's opinion. You have an Ashkenazic view, you have a Sephardic view, so now everyone can look at the Code of Jewish Law and come out with an understanding of Jewish law. Now it's actually interesting that the Code of Jewish Law was such an incredible work that almost all Jews around the world have accepted the Code of Jewish Law as their source for Jewish law, for all legal advice, so to say. Not everyone the Rambam did a great job, but not everyone people don't look at the Rambam as their source for how to live as a Jew. The Code of Jewish Law became like the source for how everyone goes to the Code of Jewish Law to find out how to what the law is, what's the deal. Now it's interesting that on the Code of Jewish Law there happens to also be commentaries now on the side, which further discuss new questions that come up, and that really continues all the way until today, discussing more and more questions, adding to that Code of Jewish Law. But either way, let's look at figure 6.4, page 226, and you'll see all the 4 different stages of halachic discussions here. We have the Tshuvot HaGaonim, which were responses to questions that were posed to that generation. The next, we have halachic Hilchot HaRif, which was the halachic digest. The Rif put together just some cliff notes on the Talmud to give us a better understanding of the end discussion. Then we have the Mishnah Torah, which was put together by the Rambam, and it was a halachic code, and he really covered every halachic subject from from whether, laws of kosher to the laws of the temple, everything. And the next, after that, we have the Code of Jewish Law, known as the Shulchan Aruch, which was put together by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and the glosses were added by Rabbi Moshe Isserlis. And this was, they covered every single topic which is relevant to Jewish people, but only post-temple. So they don't talk about laws that only apply in the temple. So they're not going to talk about laws about what the Kohen would do when he walked into the temple, because we don't have a temple. It's not practical anymore. When we get the temple, they'll have to add that to the Code of Jewish Law, but until then, it's not relevant. So they didn't put that in, but they discuss all types of questions, and including modern questions that come up that people may ask or have asked. And that's the Shulchan Aruch. So, when it comes to understanding the Talmud, it's not just about halacha. It's not only about Jewish law. As we mentioned, the Talmud is great for sharpening your mind, getting you to think critically, getting you to think properly. But also, the Talmud is a discussion about God's Torah. And we mentioned that when we study God's Torah, we're really connecting to God. We're tapping into that God's wisdom. So the more and more we could discuss the Talmud, even if it's not about what the law is, there's still a value in just studying the Talmud for the wisdom itself. So there were many sages who added explanations to the Talmud that were not necessarily don't have anything to do with the code of Jewish law. They have nothing to do with Jewish law at all. It's just, how do we understand this discussion? One of the most notable commentaries, let's see, before I get there, page 228, 6.5, you'll see a classic layout of the Talmud. There, you'll see in the middle section is the words of the Talmud. On the right side and the left side, you'll have commentaries on both sides. The right side, you'll have Rashi. The left side, you'll have what we call a Tosfos. We'll talk about that in a second. So these are commentaries. Now I want to point, if you look at it, you'll notice that there's no punctuation. There's no punctuation in the Talmud. There's no commas. There's no periods. There's no question marks. There's no exclamation marks. How are you supposed to read a book without any sentences?
The Torah is the same way.
The Torah is the same way, yeah. I know, right? It's hard. You read the Torah. you gotta study it from a Chumash first. But we don't have a Chumash for the Talmud. We don't have a Talmud with vowels. Or I mean, now we do actually. But in the up until the last 50 years, we never had a Talmud with vowels. Actually, let me tell you exactly when they made the first Talmud with vowels. It's in the back of your book. Page 240. (1965) was the first Talmud put together with vowels. Isn't that crazy? That's what, 50 years ago? How long was that? Something like that? What? 60 years ago? There we go. 60 years ago. First Talmud with vowels. Until then, you just had to, how do you know the Talmud says? You gotta study in yeshiva. You gotta learn it from a rabbi who learned the Talmud from his rabbi, who learned it from his rabbi, all the way back to the time the Talmud was put together. And they were telling, oh yeah, this is what it says. Now I want to point out that in those days, in the time when they put the Talmud together, they spoke, I think we mentioned this, the Rambam mentions that they spoke this language. This was a normal language. People spoke this as like a conversation, as Aramaic. Today, people don't talk this language anymore. So the only way to know it is if you studied it by someone who learned it right? It's pretty.
Why did they stop it?
Why they stop what?
Down there.
No one stopped it. It just went extinct. You know.
Well, the cottage is, one is cottage and
Yeah, that's when it was put together. Same era. Yeah. So the Talmud, reading the Talmud requires a lot of skill. You gotta study a lot of Talmud to be able to read the Talmud, and just get the words. You know, forget about the understanding. In our class, we went through everything with explanation, with texts, and with vowels, and it was also in English, thanks to the beautiful JLI books. But we figured it out. We had a lot of help. But what do you do if you did before they came up with all these aid books to help us? So it's difficult stuff. So I want to just give you an example. Let's look at page 229, text number 7. So if you look at figure 6.6 right on top of that, this is a text from an edition of the Talmud. And you see, there's literally it's just words on a page. It's almost impossible to read. But anyway, let's read text 7. Here's I'm going to read this. This is a section, a literal translation of the Talmud, something that we learned. We learned this whole discussion about whether what's the scenario where someone has a right to complain but no ability to actually sue the person. They have no legal claim, right? So here's an actual translation of the Talmud with no vowels, no added words, just straight up. Let's read text number 7, page 229. What is the case if that the employer said to them at 4 and he went and said to them at 3? What is the function of complaint he knew and accepted? If the employer said to him at 3 and he went and said to them at 4, what is the case if he told them your wages are on me? He gives them from his own. Understood? Right? It's like how you supposed to know where the comma is, where the period is, what's going on. So I'm gonna go through the discussion we went through last week, just an outside, just one part of it, not the whole thing, because we went through a lot last week, but just a little part of it, and then I'm gonna read it again with the punctuation. You'll see what I'm talking about. Once you kind of know the discussion and you remember the discussion, you'll be like, oh yeah, I see that. That makes sense. So it's right there. So what do we say? We had a whole discussion in the Talmud about where can there be a case where someone has the right to complain, but yet no ability to actually sue anyone for that claim. In other words, he has a valid complaint, but no legal claim. He can't actually fight for that money in court. So we're trying to figure out what kind of scenario would a person have that ability. So the Gemara says, maybe, possibly, we're talking about someone as an agent, someone as a middleman. And there's a little bit of a miscommunication. So the employer says, I'll give 4 zuz for a certain job. I'll give 4 zuz for a certain job. If you guys do this job for me, I'll give 4 zuz. The agent went and he hired guys, but he told them that they're going to only get 3 zuz. They come, they do the work, and at the end of the work, they get 3 zuz, but they found out that the guy was willing to pay 4 zuz. So should they have a right to complain? No, because they were told that they're going to get 3, and they got 3. You know, what's their complaint about? The fact that they could have got 4? That's not a valid complaint. So that can't be what the Mishnah is talking about. So maybe it's the other way around. The Gemara says maybe the employer said, I'll give 3 zuz for a job. The middleman, the agent, went and hired employees and told them you'll get 4 zuz. Now the workers come, they think they're going to get 4 zuz for the job. And at the end of the job, they only get 3 zuz. And now they're upset. Now they have a complaint. That's a valid complaint. Right? So but the Gemara says, wait a second. If the middleman said that I'll pay you 4 zuz, then they should sue the middleman. He said he'll pay. So they could sue him for the last zuz. Right? So the Gemara finishes off and says that it must be that the middleman didn't say I'll pay you. He said the employer will pay you. So he didn't make himself liable to pay them anything. He was just hooking them up for their job. He said the employer will pay you 4 zuz. In fact, when the employer never said he'll pay 4 zuz, he said he'll pay 3 zuz. So now these workers have a valid complaint. Their complaint is that we were told we're going to get 4 zuz, but they have no one to sue because they can't sue the middleman because he never made himself liable. He never said that I'll pay you. And the employer never promised 4 zuz. He only promised 3 zuz. So they can't sue him either. So now they have a valid complaint, but no one to sue for it. No legal claim. So that's must be what the Mishnah is talking about. So now let's read this again inside, and you'll see it's exactly what I just said in about 5 lines. So the Gemara says, the Gemara says, what's the case? In other words, what's the scenario in which someone has a valid claim but no legal claim? Right? What is the case? Question mark. If it's that the employer said to them, the agent, at 4, in other words, he'll give 4. And he meaning the agent went and said to them, meaning he went to the workers and said, I'll give you 3. What is the function? What is the function of a complaint? He knew and accepted. In other words, the workers, they were told 3 and they got 3. So what are they complaining about? That's not a complaint. Continues the Gemara. If the employer said to him at 3, in other words, the employer said, I'll give 3 zuz. And the agent went and said to them, I'll give 4. So the Gemara says, wait. What's the scenario again? What are we talking about? If he told them that if the agent said, I'll pay, the wages are on me, then he should give from his own money because he promised them money. So the Gemara finishes off saying, obviously he didn't say that. He said that the employer will pay. But as you can see, once you add in those commas and periods and question marks and those few extra words that fill in the sentence, it becomes legible. But the Gemara is not actually written like that. So you got to actually go to, you got to study a lot of Talmud. That's what you got. You got to study a lot of Talmud to really understand how the Talmud talks. Once you understand how the Talmud talks, you can really understand and decipher the Talmud's words. Now, in the past, in the early generations after the Talmud was put together, this was obvious. Everyone knew how to read Talmud like that. But as generations go on, it gets a lot more difficult to read the Talmud because certain translations get lost. Sometimes you could say one word and everyone knows the concept that you're talking about, but not necessarily a few generations later do you know what they're talking about. So it gets a little difficult. So what happens is you need to have commentaries who put together pieces of information to help us in understanding the Talmud. The first one we're going to talk about is Rashi. Everyone heard of Rashi? Most people heard of Rashi. Rashi is the most widely known commentary on the Talmud. He also made a whole commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah, but he put together a commentary almost the entire Talmud. He didn't end up finishing the whole work, but almost the entire Talmud has his commentary on the side. And if you look back to your page of the Talmud on page 228, the Rashi's commentary is always on the inside of the page, which on this page is on the right side. The Rashi became the authoritative guide to Talmud study because he gave always a simple explanation, adding in those few words of the Talmud, and sometimes even telling you where the question mark is or where the period is to give you that understanding of how to read the Talmud. So if you want to understand Talmud, just look at Rashi, and Rashi will be an incredible aid. It's not perfect. You still have to know a lot of knowledge about Talmud to fully understand it, but you could at least get a lot further. So if you look, let's put it on the page here. So Rashi, let's look at an example from Rashi, page 230, text 8. So the Gemara asked a question in the beginning of our discussion. The Gemara said, Heichi dami, which literally we translated as, what is the case? What is the case? What does it mean? What is the case? What is that? What is the case? What is the case of what? What? What's the situation of what? What are we talking about? So Rashi adds a few words. He says, what is the case that gives them a right to complain, but nothing more? So he gives us just those few words that allows us to realize where the Gemara is going. Where's this discussion taking us? What is the case that gives these employees a right to complain, but yet no legal claim, no ability to sue anyone? And once you understand those few lines, you go like, okay, now I can understand where this Gemara is going to head, and it gives you a better, just a guide in understanding what's going on. And Rashi really helps us understand that. Besides for Rashi, there's additional commentaries, which I'm going to call innovative commentaries. Rashi had a few grandsons who got together. They called themselves the Tosfos. The Tosfos were a group of rabbis and sages who began asking questions on the Talmud, not legal questions, just trying to understand the Talmud itself. And they asked questions like, wait a second, the Talmud says here that, such and such, and the Talmud says something the opposite in another section of the Talmud in a different tractate. How does that work? How does that work? It's a contradiction or seemingly contradiction. They would ask questions. How do we understand this concept? And sometimes their questions are so puzzling. You're like, how did I understand this piece of Talmud before I read that Tosas? Like sometimes they ask the most blaring questions that we didn't even think of ourselves. And that's really what they came to do. They came to add innovative insights into the Talmud. So they would resolve a lot of these questions. So if there's a contradiction, they would have to resolve how it's not really a contradiction. This Talmud piece must be talking about this Talmud piece, it must be talking about that, and it's not really a contradiction. And they started this concept called chidushim. I wish we had a key term for it. We don't. But either way, chidush means a novelty or an innovative insight. Where did it go? It's on the board. Chidushim means a novel insight, which I thought it would be in the book, but it's not. It means a novel insight. It's a new way of understanding it, and it's not necessarily nothing to do with legal questions. Just trying to understand the Talmud itself. So, if you look at text 9, page 230, you'll see how Rabbi Shlomo Luria, the Rashal, gives his view on the Tosfos or other commentaries who do similar style. They made the Talmud like a ball, spinning it and rolling it from place to place until it was all smooth and interconnected. I'm not sure exactly what kind of ball, but maybe like a clay ball or something, where the more you kind of smooth it out, you sand it down, it kind of just, it create, you kind of smooth out all the inconsistencies and all the edges. And the Tosfos did an incredible job, but that didn't stop with the Tosfos. It continued on for generations. If you look back at the page of the Talmud, page 228, you'll see we have the Gemara in the middle, and we have the right side is Rashi, and the left side is Tosfos. And you'll notice that Tosfos only has about 4 commentaries, 4 discussions, I should say, on the page, while Rashi has like 20 something. Rashi will comment on every word, every sentence, every line. How do we understand? Like, how do we read the Talmud? Because Rashi is really more about a simple reading. The Tosfos is understanding that Rashi is going to give us the simple reading, but we're going to tackle the bigger issues. How does this work with another piece of the Talmud that seemingly contradicts this piece of the Talmud? And the Tosfos will ask those questions and give us a better insight. So there's only 4 discussions on this page, but those discussions can be very deep. And sometimes they're simple questions, and sometimes they're very deep questions. But either way, it's not a running commentary, but just a few insights here and there. Over the last 1,500 years, the study of Talmud continues to be discussed and studied till today. People innovating new more and more insights to the Talmud. As the Mishnah writes, text 10, Ben Bagbag said, this is page 231, Ben Bagbag said, turn it over again, for it contains everything. Look into it, grow gray and old over it, and do not budge from it, for you have no better portion than it. Talking about the Talmud. The more and more you discuss it, the more and more you'll find more and more insights. Because the truth is, the Talmud is really has this infinite concept to it, that you could always find more insights and always bring up new questions that arise. So Talmud study really never ends. You could always continue to study the Talmud and come up with more and new questions and new answers and new chidushim. In fact, every single novel idea that someone will come up with is really all part of Torah. It's all part of the Torah. Because we got the principles of how to study Torah from Moses, from Moshe at Mount Sinai. And then ever since then, we use those principles to understand the Torah. And as long as you kind of stick within those guidelines, you're kind of free to understand and study as our minds allow us to make it make sense. So let's read text 11. This is a beautiful text. The insights, page 231, the insights that a veteran student will in the future say in front of his teacher were all given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Not literally given to Moses at Mount Sinai, but the principles to get there were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So it may as well have been said to Moses at Mount Sinai. But the idea is that I, as an individual, can add to the body of Torah by adding my novel insight and giving my 2 cents, so to say, to the Torah's the vast knowledge. And as long as I'm within the principles of how to study Talmud, I could come up with a new idea. Here's text 12a. We'll do 12a and 12b. This is from the Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. He says, seeing that all the innovations in Torah must be built on the principles that Moses received from Mount Sinai, it emerges that all was given to Moses at Sinai, essentially. Nonetheless, when a veteran student toils with their mind to reveal a specific idea within the oral Torah, an idea that accords with the Torah's principles, they create something truly original in the Torah. So a lot of times you ask the question, what was the authorial intent? What did the author mean when he said, that line? So you could ask that question reading the Talmud. When you're reading the Talmud, what did Rav Ashi mean when he said this? What did Rav Huna mean when he said that? And it could be up for debate, really. But the beautiful thing about the Talmud is that because ultimately the Talmud is a wisdom from God, it's all God's wisdom just being recorded by the sages. And because it's really a body of knowledge that's written down, the oral Torah, with it all using the principles of the oral Torah, I could read Rav Huna or Rav Ashi or any other great sage in the Talmud and try to understand it to the best of my knowledge. And if I could come up with an interesting way of understanding it, as long as it aligns with the the Torah's principles, then I could come up with a new idea. And that's it's pretty powerful. Text 12b continues the Rebbe. Every Jew has the obligation not only to study that which is already published in sacred books, but also to innovate. The Rebbe would always encourage students, as many rabbis do, to study, and then once you study, to try and innovate. Now, an innovation usually starts with a question. You got to ask a question. Now, you ask a question on the Talmud, you ask a question on other commentaries on the Talmud, and now you got to look for answers. So where do you look for answers? You look at other commentaries of the Talmud, or you look at other rabbis who may have already asked that question. If you could find no rabbis who asked that question, then you start looking around, you start asking, but at one point you could come up with your own answer to the question using all the knowledge that you have within that topic. You could come up with your own understanding. So here's a beautiful video about a student in yeshiva. Right after the Rebbe said this, he said that we should try and innovate new ideas in the Talmud. He came up with his own idea, and let's see what happens. Okay, one second. So the Talmud study and innovation is a journey that never ends, only advances. And the validity is very valid because as long as you're staying within the principles of the Torah, it's a valid interpretation of the Torah. So let's
Tradition and innovation are oxymorons. Tradition means preserving the past. Innovation demands change. But the Jewish nation excels at both, constantly generating fresh interpretations of traditional texts because the Torah's ancient guidelines allow for endless originality of thought. In recent times, the Lubavitcher Rebbe treated the Torah's tradition of creativity to an unprecedented innovation of its own.
אף על פי was פלפולי די רייסה ist הדבר הכי גודל, aber בנגיע zu drucken das und mefit sein, ist lei כל הרייסה ליטה לסק, jitel, es darf sein mehr nicht wie die, was haben auf drauf, Eira Brur, als sollen sich damit echt vernehmen, beschasse geworden die Riedes Haderis, und Limud Hatera, Alpiklole Hatera, und Bedarke Hatera, und in Memese Ifanim, dafür haben Asirus Miyuchad, und Aidet Miyuchad, Vechulhu, der Farid Kedai, auf mir Ede sein und Misare sein, und die alle, was kann sein, als seine Scheiche zu Chidush und Teira.
The Rebbe handed the keys of innovation to whomever studies Torah. He campaigned for students of every age and stage of knowledge to seek and discover novel insights within all the classic works of the Jewish tradition, and to publicize those discoveries.
Habe ich gebeten, Menschen, da kann man mit Kenntnis, dass die Schiris, was gibt mir Reis, Käfze, Aloche, Käfze, Geduschen, für die Rotsche Schiris, viele von den älteren Bochern, haben das sehr geteilt für die Bochern, weil der Walle seine Sachen nicht älter. Ich als Bocher viel, dass man erwartet, man soll etwas mechanisch sein, ist bekommt Chesed.
Back in 1986, Rabbi Ruvi New was a student who hesitatingly heeded the Rebbe's call. He submitted what he thought was an original challenge to a text of Rashi's commentary on the Torah to his yeshiva's journal. His entry was then read by the Rebbe himself.
a question popped into my head, which I quickly suppressed. I thought that that was something, for the big leaguers. One of the members of the editorial board said, put all of those calculations to the side. This is what the Rebbe wants, so just write it. My question is the first one published because it's the first Rashi of Bamidbar. And then I see on the bottom a note from the editor, Rabbi Galitsky. The question has been dealt with extensively by some of the classic commentaries on Rashi. The person who submitted the question did not take the time to do any research and look into Rashi's commentaries. So you talk about being thrown under the bus. Anyway, the next day it came to that point of the Farbrengen where the Rebbe was now going to talk about the Rashi. He said, the question was submitted about the first Rashi. I remember like shaking like a leaf. And then he says, even though the commentaries address this issue, in light of the fact that the person who submitted the question also asked a similar question from the beginning of Parshas Bahar, means that we therefore need to find a singular answer that can resolve the question both from the beginning of Bamidbar and also Bahar. The Rebbe then proceeded to give a beautiful explanation as to both Rashis. After the Farbrengen, the first person that I looked for was Rabbi Galitsky. He said no, with a big smile on his face. He said, no, the Rebbe is angenommen for dir, the Rebbe defended you.
Every Jew is encouraged to drink from the divine wellsprings of Torah wisdom. And every Jew is empowered to become a fountain of fresh Torah ideas.
So the
He knew how to deal with it.
huh?
He knew how to deal with it.
The Rebbe, yeah.
What I'm curious about is what, with AI and Siri, what's AI and Siri going to be doing with Talmud?
That's a good question. A good question.
I'm sure that there's somebody, I'm sure people are working on it today.
There's some very good AI agents out there with Torah that I use.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying is.
AI will never be able to rule a halachic decision, but AI could definitely be an aid to understanding the Torah, help you out.
Definitely.
100%. Yeah.
It's a good learning aid.
Yeah.
It's when someone thought of the answer to the question before you. AI is so original.
So the truth is that we've had this already for years. Before AI, there's a program that they took all of the texts from every single commentary that was accessible, and they put it into this program called Otzer HaChachma, which means the treasure of wisdom, literally. And they basically do is you just search. It's a search engine. You just search a word, and it just gives you every single time that word is discussed in any commentary. So this was like the original AI before AI. So if you're looking about it, you're trying to figure out. Let's say you have a question about a Rashi in the portion of Bamidbar. So you just write in the Rashi, write the words of the Rashi, and anyone who ever quotes that Rashi to discuss it, it'll pop up, and then you could read all the commentaries and go through them and look for your answer. This is obviously newer, but either way, we'll finish off with one last point. So when it comes to understanding the Talmud, when it comes to realizing that the Talmud is our treasure, it's really the heart and soul of Judaism, and that's why, as we mentioned at the very, very beginning of this course, the Talmud was burned in the center of town, because even the anti-Semites know that the Talmud is how the Jewish people survive. If we don't have the Talmud, then there's no Jewish nation. We have no way of knowing what our tradition is. The Talmud is our tradition. It's the heart and soul of Judaism. And without it, what is Judaism already? So there's a few. I want to just give you guys a few ways of how people today study the Talmud. Contemporary Talmud study regimens. The first one is called Chalukas Hashas. Chalukas Hashas is a system where you have a group of people and they all take upon themselves one tractate from the Talmud, and every one of those people within the group studies their own tractate, and together as a group you finish the entire Talmud in 1 year, which as a group, as a collective group, you could it's pretty impressive that we all finished the Talmud. Okay, I only did one part of it, but it's still very impressive. Another way of studying Talmud is called Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is a book put together with all of the non-legal parts of the Talmud. So all of the fun stuff, all the good stuff, all the stories, all the insights, the theological discussions. In fact, I actually just bought the whole set and I started reading. It's very, very fascinating. All the interesting stuff, and it's only the interesting stuff, all the exciting stuff. So there's people that have a once a week class, or some people do it once a day. They read a little bit of the Ein Yaakov, book. Another common one is called Daf Yomi, where people read a page from the Talmud every single day. And if you read a two-sided page called a Daf Yomi means every day. Daf Yomi, a page a day, you'll finish the entire Talmud in about 7.5 years. It sounds long, but that's also pretty short. Think about it. We live, I don't know, close to 90 years, let's say, 120, God willing. But you could think about how many times you could finish the Talmud. If you do it every 7.5 years, there's a lot of times you can finish the Talmud. But it's also, you put yourself to it. You say, I want to finish the entire Talmud. It's a big task, but only 7 years. That's all it takes. The last one is where am I at? I don't do Daf Yomi. So the last one is called the Mishnah Torah, which many people have accustomed to read the Rambam every single day. The Rambam is not the Talmud, but the Rambam is the laws which are based on the Talmud. only the legal parts of the Talmud. Basically, only the end law, end discussion of the Talmud. So if you want to get a full discussion of you want to get a full understanding of every single mitzvah in the entire Torah that's discussed in the Talmud, but just the end law, without the whole discussion of Rav Papa and Rav Huna and all the other rabbis who discussed the analytical stuff, just the end ruling, you could learn the Rambam. And some people do 3 chapters a day, and they finish the Rambam every single year. Once you could finish the Rambam every year by doing 3 chapters a day, or you could do 1 chapter a day and finish the Rambam every 3 years. Different people do different things depending on how much time you have in your day. But either way, these are some beautiful ways to bring the Talmud into your life and continue on the tradition, pass it on to the next generation. This is us. We're going to be the ones to do it. If not us, then who? So yeah.
Stay on this, Dr. Yomi, don't they meet in Madison Square Garden every 7.5 years when they finish?
They don't do it always at Madison Square Garden, but they do have a big celebration, and every year they do it somewhere else. I think last one was at Madison Square Garden.
I guess so.
Yeah, they did one at the MetLife Stadium as well.
Is there one down here?
No, I mean I don't think so. I mean they may do a small one, but not as big as that. Here, people fly in from all over the place to go to join that one. But that was like I don't know 4 years ago. So they're smack in the middle now. So another like 3.5 years, you go to join the. I mean, you could always jump on in. They're in the middle of the laws of. They're in the middle of the book, the tractate of Sanhedrin, the rules, all the laws discussing the Sanhedrin, the court that stood in Jerusalem. What did the Sanhedrin need to know, and how do you be part of the Sanhedrin, and all those good stuff. It's exciting. It's an exciting one. Either way, to end off with one last story, a lot of people think, listen, Rabbi, it's very nice you're encouraging me to study the Talmud, but I'm already throwing your age. And, it's not going to happen. I'm not, and there's no way I'm going to be able to study the Talmud. So there's a story told about Rabbi Akiva, and I want to read it for you. Page 238, text 14. How did Rabbi Akiva begin his journey to scholarship? It is told that he was 40 years old, and he never studied in his life, but he was once standing at the mouth of a well and asked, "Who carved a hole in this stone over here?" The people there told him it was formed by the water that constantly dripped onto it, striking the same spot day after day. Rabbi Akiva told himself, if a substance so soft can carve its way through material so hard, then surely the words of the Torah that are like iron can engrave themselves within my heart, which is mere flesh and blood. He immediately set out to start studying Torah. He went with his young son. They sat down before the teachers of young children. He literally went to school with his kid. He said to one, "Rabbi, teach me Torah." He then took hold of one end of a tablet, and his son took hold of the other end. The teacher wrote down an aleph and a bet for him, and he studied those 2 letters. He continued studying until he mastered the entire Torah. A lot of times we think, my mind, I tried studying before, it just doesn't enter, it doesn't go, I can never retain that information. And it's important to remember that Rabbi Akiva learns from water hitting a rock, that with enough consistency and enough persistence, you can do almost anything. If you want to study the Torah, you want to study the Talmud, as difficult and as complicating as it is, it's doable. And it's been done, and it can be done again. And with that, we'll finish. We end today's lesson.